Whether you sang it here last week or have at some other time sung Shelley Jackson Denham's We Laugh, We Cry, you'll probably know the answer to this riddle. Why is Jeopardy the most popular game show amongst Unitarian Universalists? Because to question truly is the answer. Our services this month come with titles in the form of questions. The first question to be chosen is actually the title of the last service in the series, and that's because it was proposed by Connie Keller, who won the right to pick a sermon topic for me at last year's UUFP auction. So mark your calendars now for November 7th, and you could be the one having me preach on a subject of your choosing. The topic that Connie gave me is the question, what then must we do? It's the title of a book by Leo Tolstoy, author of War and Peace, or at least that's one way of translating his Russian title into English. And the question actually comes from the biblical book named Luke. In the Bible, of course, it's part of a description of events involving John the Baptist. John has explained some things to the people who have come to be baptized by him, and in response they ask him that question. That's why there's a then in the question. Given all that you have said to us, the people are essentially saying, what should we do about it? As the subject of a sermon, then, the question can't stand by itself. Something else has to come first, to set the scene so that the then in the question makes sense. And so I thought that there could be other sermons addressing other questions that come before it, and since Connie's question comes from the Bible, maybe the others could too. So on July 19th, UUFP member Alice Smith will preach on another question from Luke, this one asked of Jesus, who is my neighbour? The Sunday before that, our student minister Chris Hockman, who this morning is preaching in Williamsburg, will respond to a question asked by Jesus, according to the book named John. What are you looking for? And today my title comes from John 2, another question asked of John the Baptist. Who are you? In this way, we'll move from fundamental matters of identity, desire, and kinship before we conclude this month with purpose. An important rule of thumb taught in many seminaries and theological schools when it comes to talking about identity, particularly if you're going to be talking about other people's identities, is to take ownership of your own identity first. On that basis, then, I am a straight, white, cisgender man, married and a father, educated and middle class, a homeowner with good credit, in my mid-40s, and for the most part, able-bodied. In all those regards, I am somebody with a considerable amount of privilege in our society, most of it unearned privilege. Now, I am an immigrant, but I'm from England, and on the whole, I was immediately accepted by white American culture. Most people like my accent, even though, listening to the recordings that we've just started making of sermons, I'm not totally sure what accent I have anymore. It's not English, it's not American, and yes, I do pronounce some words strangely. In any case, it's a good idea to be as aware as you can of your own identity. Generally, we're only aware of those characteristics of ourselves that make it harder for us to live in our society. Women are generally more aware of gender than men. People of colour are generally more aware of race than white people. Everyone has multifaceted identities, and yet privilege sets up straight, white, cisgender men like me as normal, and thus beyond scrutiny, while everyone else deviates from what is normal. And heaven forbid that everyone else should have the same rights as the privileged minority, because that would be some sort of reverse-ism. So it's important to consider all the characteristics of your own identity, because that is the imperfect lens through which you see the world and everyone else in it. It's important to answer, who are you, for yourself first, before you concern yourself with somebody else's answer. Now, matters of identity have been in the news a lot recently. In April, the media spotlight was shone on gender identity when the Olympic decathlon champion, formerly known as Bruce Jenner, came out as a transgender woman in a 2020 interview with Diane Sawyer. Then, a little over a month ago, Caitlyn Jenner made her debut on the cover of Vanity Fair and described her happiness in finally living as her true self. Reaction was on the whole positive, with many people talking about her courage, her inspiring bravery, showing how far our society has really progressed. In the media, at least, there was little hostility beyond the microaggressions of not using Jenner's preferred names and pronouns, but it was also noticeable, how quickly some people started discussing her physical appearance, particularly in regards to her age, judging her clothes and her makeup. Yay, sexism. As the Daily Show's Jon Stewart put it, Caitlyn Jenner, congratulations. Welcome to being a woman in America. Then there's what actress and LGBT advocate Laverne Cox wrote in response to Jenner's debut. Noting the ways in which certain standards of beauty were being applied to Jenner just as they'd been to her when she was on the cover of Time last year, Cox notes that there are many trans folks who, because of genetics and or lack of material access, will never be able to embody these standards. More importantly, many trans folks don't want to embody them and shouldn't have to in order to be seen as ourselves and respected as ourselves. It is important to note that these standards are also informed by race, class, and ability, among other intersections. Later in the same Tumblr post, she continues, most trans folks don't have the privileges Caitlyn and I have. It is those trans folks whom we must continue to lift up, get them access to healthcare, jobs, housing, safe streets, safe schools, and homes for our young people. We must lift up the stories of those most at risk, statistically trans people of colour who are poor and working class. And Cox concludes, I hope, as I know Caitlyn does, that the love she is receiving can translate into changing hearts and minds about who all trans people are, as well as shifting public policies to fully support the lives and well-being of all of us. The struggle continues. Here's something we could do to be on the right side of that struggle right here. One aspect of gender identity that's been in the media recently is bathroom access. Just this week, for instance, the Department of Justice determined that a transgender student has the legal right to require Gloucester High School to let him use the boys' bathroom, something the school district has opposed because the student was assigned the sex of female at birth. But gender is a lot more complicated than one's sexual organs. There's gender expression, which involves outward appearance and behaviour, and gender identity, which is about the individual's internal sense of who they are, and they don't necessarily align with the sex that someone was assigned at birth. So saying this bathroom is for men and this bathroom is for women, that is a simplistic binary, and it privileges cisgender people whose gender expression and identity do match their sex, but puts transgender, genderqueer and gender non-conforming individuals at a disadvantage. Bathrooms for men and bathrooms for women basically sends a message saying, this place is for cisgender people only. That's a problem when we say we value the inherent worth and dignity of each person, and yet the inherent worth of a person includes their gender. Now, before we get too far down the road of Mike Huckabee's creepy fantasies about girls' locker rooms, there is thankfully a simple solution. Over in the office building, the bathrooms are single-user, so anyone can use them without worrying about it. Actually, even cisgender people worry about the bathrooms in this building, given that, so I'm told, the stall doors in the women's bathroom tend to open all by themselves. I'm also told that some women here won't even use the bathroom, given that the stalls are so easily seen from the social area if the bathroom door is opened. So making both of the bathrooms in this building single-user means that anyone could use them without worrying about privacy or stall doors that don't close right. What's more, we could then make the bathrooms fully accessible for people with mobility challenges, and we could even put changing tables in them, in both of them, to make them more useful to parents. Yes, fathers change diapers too. Shortly after Caitlyn Jenner's Vanity Fair cover, the media spotlight swung to another matter of identity, namely racial identity. That was when the parents of NAACP Spokane chapter president Rachel Dolezal made a public statement that their daughter was in fact white and not black as she had been identifying herself. When asked by a television reporter if she was African American, Dolezal said she didn't understand the question and then walked away. But in later interviews confirmed that she does consider herself to be black, even though both her parents are white and with primarily Northern European ancestry going back generations. Reactions to this covered the spectrum, from acknowledging its bizarreness, as ably demonstrated by the black cast members of The Nightly Show with Larry Wilmore, to outrage over the harm done to African American causes, not to mention making it more difficult to be biracial in America. And given their proximity in time, it's not surprising that Dolezal's story was compared to Jenner's. After all, both race and gender are social constructs, with much more to do with how people perceive themselves and others than anything actually determined by biology. So if one person can be transgender, changing in how the world sees them from being male to being female, perhaps it is possible, the thinking might go, for another person to be transracial, changing from white to black. Now, there are good reasons why it's not as simple a parallel as it might sound. And going into those reasons is beyond the scope of my sermon this morning. But what is pretty simple when it comes to Dolezal's case is that she was intentionally deceptive, whether referring to an older black friend who appeared in pictures with her as her father, or asking one of her adopted brothers, who is African American, to tell people that she was too. It's possible to admire a culture without appropriating it, after all. And it's possible to engage with the cause of marginalized people without claiming to be one of those people. Maybe the conversation about this could have continued, and that would have been good, because white people in particular need to have a conversation about racial identity in this country, particularly what it means to be white in this country. This was certainly an opportunity, as Alicia Ford recommended in our reading this morning, to make room for holy curiosity rather than clinging to certainty. Maybe that conversation could have continued, but on June 17th, a young white man killed 9 African American people in a Bible study group at Emmanuel AME Church in Charleston, South Carolina. In the days that followed, as we grieved and prayed and responded in love, the nation's attention was brought to bear on one particular symbol of a particular white identity, that symbol being the Confederate flag. Now, I remember hearing about campaigns to remove the Confederate flag from the state capitol and other government buildings in South Carolina some 15 years ago. But now, and in a very short amount of time, public officials are changing their minds about flying the flag and allowing that it shouldn't be flown after all. Of course, some are saying that the flag shouldn't be touched, defending it as representing heritage, not hate. But you don't need to hate African Americans to believe in white supremacy. You don't actually need to hate if you believe, as did US Senator from South Carolina John C. Calhoun, that slavery was not wrong, not even a necessary evil, but actually a positive good. Oh, and you know what street Mother Emanuel Church is on in Charleston? Calhoun Street. It's perhaps not surprising, strike that, not perhaps, but rather sadly not surprising, that there's been blowback. When a privileged group stops getting its way, even when it simply looks like it might stop getting special treatment because others are demanding the same rights, then the privileged group often feels it's being oppressed, maybe even attacked. So on the one hand, the Ku Klux Klan is planning a rally at the South Carolina state capitol on Saturday to protest the removal of the Confederate flag. And yes, that's their right to do so under the First Amendment, but what blows my mind is that such a public display of white supremacism is actually moderate compared to what's on the other hand. And that's because in the 2 or 3 weeks since the massacre at Mother Emanuel, there's been a whole series of fires at black churches across the South. And at least 4 of them have been confirmed as acts of arson. That has always been one of the tools of the Confederate legacy, to respond to a perceived attack against white supremacy with an actual attack against black identity. As UU Minister Jason Lydon put it during a recent interfaith conference call to organize white faith leaders, black churches have always been sources of power and strength in black communities. They've been places of community building and organizing, with histories dating back long before the Civil Rights Movement, even, as for Mother Emanuel, before the Civil War. So we need to do a lot more than demand that a particular flag stop being flown over government buildings. It's an important step, because symbols do matter, but it's not the be-all and end-all of the struggle. I'll talk more about that on July 26th, but for today I do want to finish by coming back to the question of identity that gave its title to this sermon. Who are you? Every person's identity includes how they relate to people with a different identity. That's one of the reasons why we have to take ownership of our own identities first, and not just the parts that society constantly points out to us because how we look or sound or act, but also the parts that society considers normal, the standard against which all other differences are judged. Men need to know what it means to have a male identity when society seems to be much more concerned about what it means to be a woman. Straight cisgender people need to figure out what that identity means when society is all too preoccupied with what it means to be lesbian, gay or bisexual, or transgender or genderqueer. White people really need to figure out what it means to have a white identity. You have to know who you are first, or at least be trying, because it will always be an ongoing process before you can know who somebody else is. And even then, every person's identity includes how they relate to people with a different identity. Do we approach differences with a sense of holy curiosity, encountering the unfamiliar with a willingness to learn? Or do we cling to certainty that we know all that we need to know already? Do we, like the Little Prince, seek out moments of human connection in the face of the unknowable infinity of existence? Or do we, like the businessman he encounters, brush aside the possibilities for connection because we're too busy tending to matters of consequence? The good news is that unlike the Little Prince, we don't need to travel to other planets to find interesting people. As we'll sing in our closing hymn in a moment, we are all kindred pilgrim souls on this planet, all of us with questions about ourselves, about what we want, about who is with us, and about what we should do about it all. We're all in this together, so let's make this a place where we can all find good answers to our holy questions. May it be so.